The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I sat in the back row of chairs facing Mr. Henderson's mahogany desk, watching as he shuffled through the papers that would determine how my grandfather's life would be divided among the living. Around me sat my cousins, aunts, and uncles, all wearing their best funeral clothes and expressions of barely concealed anticipation. Grandpa Joe had been the patriarch of our family for as long as I could remember. At 87, he'd owned 300 acres of prime farmland in Nebraska, a house that had been in our family for 4 generations, and a collection of antique farming equipment that was worth more than most people's retirement saving. Everyone assumed there would be enough to go around. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began reading the formal language that lawyers use to distribute a lifetime of work and memory. My cousin Marcus inherited the main farmhouse and half the acreage. My cousin Sarah got the other half of the land and the modern farming equipment. My Aunt Catherine received Grandpa's stock portfolio and savings account. Uncle Bill got the vintage car collection that Grandpa had been restoring in his spare time. I listened to each bequest with growing anxiety, waiting to hear my name. Grandpa Joe and I had been closer than he'd been with most of the other grandchildren. I'd spent every summer on his farm from the time I was 8 until I graduated high school. He'd taught me to drive his old John Deere tractor, shown me how to read the weather patterns that determined planting season, and shared stories about our family's history that went back 5 generations. When Mr. Henderson finished reading the will, my name hadn't been mentioned once. Not for land, not for money, not even for one of Grandpa's old tools that I'd helped him use countless times. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone processed what they'd inherited and what I apparently hadn't. As my family filed out of the office, making plans for dividing up possessions and taking ownership of properties, I sat alone in that chair, trying to understand why Grandpa had left me nothing at all. Chapter 2. The conversation I couldn't forget. 3 days after the will reading, I drove out to Grandpa's farm one last time before Marcus took possession. The house sat empty, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun like closed eyes. I had a key. Grandpa had given it to me years ago, but using it now felt like trespassing on someone else's property. I walked around the property instead, visiting places where Grandpa and I had spent time together. The old barn where he'd taught me to milk cows, the workshop where we'd rebuilt engines and fixed anything that broke around the farm, the vegetable garden where he'd shown me the difference between weeds and the plants we wanted to keep. Every corner of this place held memories of conversations with Grandpa that had shaped who I became. He'd never been a man who expressed emotions easily, but he'd shown his love through patience, through teaching, through the time he'd invested in helping me understand the world beyond textbooks and classrooms. Standing in the workshop, I remembered a conversation we'd had the previous spring. I'd been helping him overhaul the engine on his 1952 Farmall tractor when he'd stopped working and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "David," he'd said, using my full name instead of the Davy he'd called me since childhood. "You understand that the most valuable things a man owns aren't always the things that show up on paper, don't you?" I'd nodded, thinking he was talking about memories and family relationship. He'd continued working on the engine, but I could tell he had more to say. Sometimes the things that matter most are the things nobody else knows about. The things that don't get written down in wills or talked about at family dinners. At the time, I'd thought he was being philosophical, maybe reflecting on mortality as old people sometimes do. Now, standing in his empty workshop, I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something specific, something important that I'd been too young or too distracted to understand. The memory of that conversation haunted me as I drove home that evening, wondering if I'd missed something crucial in my grandfather's words. Chapter 3. The Call from Marcus. 2 weeks later, Marcus called with an offer that surprised me. He'd moved into Grandpa's house and had been going through the accumulation of 8 decades of rural living. The barn was full of equipment and tools that weren't specifically mentioned in the will, and he needed help sorting through everything before the farm auction scheduled for the following month. "I know this is awkward," Marcus, his voice carrying the weight of family obligation. "But you knew Grandpa's stuff better than any of us. You spent more time out here learning about his tools and equipment. I could really use your help figuring out what's valuable and what's just junk taking up space." The invitation felt like a mercy. I'd been struggling with a sense of disconnection from my family since the will reading, feeling like I'd been erased from Grandpa's legacy. The chance to spend time on the farm again, even if it belonged to someone else now, was something I drove out the next Saturday morning, arriving to find Marcus standing in the barn looking overwhelmed by the sheer volume of stuff that Grandpa had accumulated over the years. Farm equipment from different eras was stacked and stored in every available space. Hand tools hung on pegboards that covered entire walls. Boxes of spare parts, hardware, and mysterious mechanical components filled shelves that reached to the barn's rafters. "Where do we even start?" Marcus asked, gesturing helplessly at the controlled chaos around us. I looked around the barn, remembering hundreds of hours I'd spent here with Grandpa. Every tool had its place. Every piece of equipment had its purpose, even if that purpose wasn't immediately obvious to someone who hadn't spent years learning Grandpa's organizational. We start with the antique equipment. That's where the real value. Grandpa had some pieces that collectors would pay serious money for. We spent the morning cataloging the most valuable pieces, and Marcus was amazed by the potential worth of equipment he'd initially dismissed. I focused on identifying the items that would interest collectors and museums, drawing on years of knowledge that Grandpa had shared with me. Chapter 4. The Antique Plow. In the far corner of the barn, covered by a canvas tarp that had seen better years, sat Grandpa's most prized piece of antique equipment, a 1898 John Deere plow that had belonged to his grandfather. I'd heard the story of this plow dozens of times. It had broken the original sod on the land that became our family farm, and Grandpa considered it the foundation of everything our family had built over the generations. Marcus had never paid much attention to the plow during family visits, but when I pulled off the tarp and revealed the ornate metalwork and pristine condition of the century-old implement, his eyes widened with surprise. "This thing is in incredible shape," he said, running his hand along the curved moldboard that had been polished to a mirror finish. "It looks like it was made yesterday." I explained how Grandpa had spent countless hours maintaining the plow, not because he planned to use it, but because it represented the sweat and determination of the man who'd started our family's farming tradition. Every winter, Grandpa would strip it down completely, oil every moving part, and reassemble it with the care of someone working on a priceless artifact. "This probably belongs in a museum," Marcus said, "or maybe we should keep it in the family." As we examined the plow more closely, I noticed something I'd never seen before. The metal base where the plow attached to the tractor tongue was secured with bolts that looked different from the rest of the hardware. They were newer, shinier, and seemed out of place on such an old implement. I knelt down to get a better look, and realized that what I was seeing wasn't original equipment. Someone had modified the plow's base, adding a small metal compartment that was hidden beneath the main frame. The compartment was secured with a simple latch, but it had been painted to match the rest of the plow so perfectly that it was nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to. My heart started beating faster as I remembered Grandpa's words about valuable things that don't show up on paper. This hidden compartment couldn't be accidental, and the careful modification suggested someone had spent considerable time creating this secret space. The discovery felt deeply personal, like a message meant specifically for someone who would understand the significance of this particular hiding place. I looked up at Marcus, who was examining other equipment and hadn't noticed my discovery. Something told me this moment was meant to be private, part of a larger puzzle that Grandpa had carefully constructed. Chapter 5. The Secret Compartment. I waited until Marcus took a break for lunch before returning to the plow. My hands were shaking slightly as I worked the hidden latch, wondering what Grandpa might have concealed in such an unusual hiding place. The compartment opened smoothly, revealing a small waterproof pouch that had been carefully wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside the pouch, I found 3 items that made my breath catch in my throat. The first was a small brass key attached to a chain, old but well-maintained, with numbers etched into the metal that looked like a combination or reference code. The second was a folded piece of paper with my name written on the outside in Grandpa's distinctive hand. The third was a photograph I'd never seen before. The photograph showed Grandpa as a young man, maybe in his early 20s, standing next to a woman I didn't recognize. They were both smiling, and the woman was holding a baby. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Joe, Margaret, and Little Mary, 1955, in fading." I'd never heard Grandpa mention any named Margaret, and I'd certainly never heard about a daughter named. According to family history, Grandpa had married my grandmother Helen in 1958, and their first child, my father, wasn't born until 1960. This photograph suggested a part of Grandpa's life that no one in the family knew about. The letter addressed to me was brief, but loaded with implications that made my head spin. "Davy, if you're reading this, then you found what I hoped you'd find. Some stories are too complicated to tell while people are still living, but too important to take to the grave." The key opened safe deposit box 247 at First National Bank in town. "Mr. Patterson knows you're coming, and he has the other key. What you find there will help you understand why I couldn't put certain things in my will. The choice of what to do with this information is yours, but I trust you to do what's right. You always understood the farm better than anyone else in the family. Love, Grandpa Joe." I sat in the barn holding these artifacts of a secret history, trying to process what Grandpa was telling me. A safe deposit box, a banker who knew I was coming, a photograph of people who weren't part of the family story I'd grown up with, and a key that would unlock whatever truth Grandpa had hidden away. Chapter 6. The Drive to Town. I told Marcus I had to run an errand in town and would be back later to continue cataloging equipment. The drive to First National Bank felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. My mind raced through possibility. most of them involving explanations that would complicate everything I thought I knew about my grandfather and my family. Mr. Patterson turned out to be the bank president, a man in his 60s who'd apparently been expecting my visit for some time. When I introduced myself and showed him the key, his expression shifted to one of relief mixed with sympathy. "Your grandfather set this up 15 years ago," he explained, as he led me to the safe deposit box vault. He updated the instructions several times over the years, always making sure we knew to expect you eventually. He said you were the one in the family who would understand what to do with what he was leaving behind. The safe deposit box was larger than I'd expected. Inside, I found documents that told a story I was completely unprepared for. There were legal papers from 1952 establishing a trust fund, bank statements showing decades of regular deposits, insurance papers, and most shocking of all, correspondence with attorneys in California regarding someone named Mary Margaret Walsh. As I read through the document, a picture began to emerge of the secret life Grandpa had kept hidden from our family for over 60 years. In 1954, while serving in the Army in California, he'd met and fallen in love with a young woman named Margaret O'Brien. They'd had a brief marriage and a daughter before Margaret died in a car accident in 1956. Unable to care for a toddler while completing his military service, Grandpa had made the heartbreaking decision to place Mary for adoption with a family in California. He'd returned to Nebraska after his discharge, met my grandmother, and started the family I knew about. But he'd never stopped loving or supporting the daughter he'd given up. The trust fund documents showed that Grandpa had been sending money to support Mary's education and later her own family for decades. The most recent correspondence indicated that Mary, now Mary Margaret Walsh, was a retired school teacher in San Diego with 3 adult children of her own. She'd known about her biological father but had respected his decision to keep their relationship private. At the bottom of the safe deposit box, I found a sealed envelope addressed to me with instructions not to open it until I'd read everything else. Inside was a letter that brought tears to my eyes. Chapter 7. Grandpa's Final Letter. Davy, the letter began. I know this is a lot to take in all at once. I've carried this secret for 60 years, and there were many times I wanted to tell someone in the family about Mary. But every year that passed made it harder to explain why I'd waited so long to share the truth. I need you to understand that I never loved your grandmother any less because of Mary. Helen was the love of my adult life, and your father and all of you grandchildren have been my greatest joy. But Mary was my first child, and a part of my heart has always belonged to her and her family. The reason I couldn't include any of this in my will is because it would have opened wounds and created questions that would hurt people who are still living. Your grandmother suspected there was something in my past, but she never asked directly, and I never volunteered the telling this story after her death felt like a betrayal of the privacy she'd chosen to give me. I'm leaving this decision to you, because you're the one in the family who understands what it means to love the land, and to care about people even when it's complicated. Mary doesn't need the money. She's done well for herself. But she deserves to know that she always had family here in Nebraska, who would have welcomed her if circumstances had been different. The trust fund contains enough money to pay for her 3 children's college educations, which was always my intention. But more than that, it contains the deed to 40 acres of the original family farm that I kept separate from the rest of the property. It's the 40 acres where our great-grandfather first built his house, where the family cemetery is located, and where the original farmstead buildings still stand. I couldn't leave this land to Mary in my public will, because it would have raised too many questions and hurt too many people. But it belongs to her, by right of being my oldest child, and I trust you to make sure she gets what's rightfully. Whether you choose to contact her directly, or handle this through lawyers is up to you, but I know you'll do what's fair and kind. I also know that 40 acres isn't much compared to what your cousins inherit, but those 40 acres are the most important ones on the entire farm. They're where our family story began, and they're where it should continue through Mary's children if they want it to. I'm sorry for keeping this secret for so long, and I'm sorry for putting this responsibility on your shoulders. But you're the one grandchild who spent enough time with me to understand that sometimes doing what's right is more complicated than doing what's easy. I love you, and I trust you. Grandpa Joe. Chapter 8. The Weight of Truth. I sat in that sterile bank vault for over an hour, reading and rereading documents that rewrote my understanding of my grandfather's life. The trust fund contained almost $400,000, money that Grandpa had quietly set aside over decades while living the modest lifestyle of a Nebraska farmer. The deed to the 40 acres was legitimate and legally separate from the property that had been distributed. But beyond the financial and legal implications, I was struggling with the emotional weight of what Grandpa had entrusted to me. This wasn't just about money or land. It was about a secret that had shaped his entire adult life, and about a sister I'd never known I had. Mr. Patterson waited patiently while I processed everything, occasionally offering practical guidance about the legal requirements for executing the trust. He'd clearly known about Mary for years and had been prepared to help facilitate whatever decisions I made about contacting. Your grandfather talked about this situation many times over the years, Mr. Patterson said gently. He always regretted not being able to be part of Mary's life, but he also didn't want to disrupt the family she'd built in California. He felt that reaching out after so many years might cause more pain than comfort. I understood Grandpa's dilemma, but I also realized that the situation was different now. Mary was in her 60s, presumably settled in her own life and relationships. Her children were adults who might be curious about their grandfather's family history, and most importantly, Grandpa was gone, so there was no longer any risk of his secret causing problems in his marriage or immediate family. The question was whether I had the right to make contact with someone who might not want to be found, even by family, and whether I was prepared to handle the family complications that would arise when my cousins learned that their inheritance wasn't as complete as they'd believed. I gathered all the documents and asked Mr. Patterson to secure them while I took time to think about my next steps. The weight of the key in my pocket felt heavier than ever as I drove back to the farm. Chapter 9. The phone call to California. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to make the phone call. I'd found Mary Margaret Walsh's contact information in the trust documents, and I'd rehearsed the conversation dozens of times in my mind. But actually, dialing her number felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When she answered, I introduced myself simply as David Thompson, Joe Thompson's grandson from Nebraska. The long pause that followed told me she understood immediately why I was calling. I wondered if this day would ever come, she said, her voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and caution. How did you find out about me? I explained about finding the key under the plow and discovering the safe deposit box. As I described the contents of Grandpa's letter and the trust he'd established, I could hear Mary's breathing become more emotional. He never forgot about me, she said quietly. I always wondered if he ever thought about the daughter he gave up. I had a good life with my adoptive family, and I never resented his decision, but there was always a part of me that wondered about my biological father and whether I had other family somewhere. Mary told me about her life in California, her career as a teacher before retirement, her marriage to a good man who'd known about her adoption from the beginning, and their 3 children who were now in their 30s and 40s. She'd always been open with her children about being adopted, but she'd never had any information about her biological father beyond his name and military service record. I did try to find him once. About 30 years ago, I hired a private investigator to see if he was still alive. The investigator found the farm in Nebraska and confirmed that Joe Thompson was living there, but I couldn't decide whether contacting him would be welcome or intrusive. I described the family farm, the house where Grandpa had lived, and the land that he'd wanted her to have. Mary listened with growing amazement as I explained the extent of what Grandpa had set aside for her and her children. I don't need his money, she said firmly. My husband and I did well for ourselves, and our children are all established in their careers. But the idea that he thought about me all these, that he wanted to provide for my children's education, that means more to me than I can express. We talked for over 2 hours that first conversation, sharing stories and filling in gaps in each other's family knowledge. Mary had photographs of herself as a child and young woman that she promised to send me. I had stories about Grandpa's later life and his pride in his family that she'd never heard. Chapter 10. The family revelation. The hardest part of honoring Grandpa's trust was deciding how and when to tell the rest of the family about Mary. I knew the revelation would complicate the inheritance situation and possibly strain family relationships. But I also knew that keeping Grandpa's secret wasn't fair to Mary or to the cousins who deserved to know they had an aunt they'd never met. I decided to start with my father, who as Grandpa's son had the strongest claim to understanding the full scope of his father's life. Dad listened to the story with a mixture of shock and gradual understanding that suggested he'd always sensed there were parts of Grandpa's past that weren't discussed. Your grandfather never talked much about his army service, Dad said, after I'd finished explaining everything. Now I understand why. He must have carried that guilt and grief for decades. Dad was supportive of my decision to honor the trust and help Mary claim her inheritance, but he was also concerned about how Marcus and Sarah would react to learning that their inheritance was going to be smaller than they'd believed. We agreed to call a family meeting and present the situation as Grandpa's final wish, rather than as my personal decision. The meeting was as difficult as I'd expected. Marcus was initially angry about the reduction in his landhold, and Sarah was confused about why Grandpa had kept such a significant secret for so long. But as we discussed the details of Mary's story and Grandpa's reasons for his secrecy, the family began to understand the impossible situation The decision to give up a child for adoption in the 1950s carried a social stigma that would have affected his ability to remarry and start a new family. Keeping the secret had probably been the only way he could move forward with his life. Uncle Bill surprised everyone by being the most supportive of reaching out to Mary. If she's Dad's daughter, then she's family, he said simply. And family means we do right by each other. even when it's complicated. Chapter 11. Mary's visit to Nebraska. 3 months after our first phone conversation, Mary flew to Nebraska to see the farm and meet the family she'd never known she had. I picked her up at the airport in Omaha, and the resemblance to Grandpa was unmistakable. She had his eyes, his stubborn chin, and his way of observing everything around her with quiet intensity. The drive to the farm gave us time to talk about what she was feeling and what she hoped to get from the visit. Mary was nervous about meeting family members who might resent her claim on their grandfather's legacy, but she was also excited about finally seeing the place where her biological father had lived and worked. When we pulled into the farmyard, Mary sat in the car for several minutes, just looking at the house and barn and fields that represented a life she might have lived if circumstances had been different. I could see her trying to imagine herself as a child in this rural setting, wondering how different her life might have been. The family gathering that evening was emotional for everyone. Mary shared photographs from her life in California, and my aunts and uncles shared stories about Grandpa that helped her understand the man who'd made such a difficult choice 60 years earlier. By the end of the evening, any resentment about the inheritance had been replaced by genuine affection for the family member they'd never known they had. Marcus surprised me by offering to sell Mary additional acreage if she wanted to expand her claim on the family farm. "This land has been in our family for over a century," he said. "If you want to be part of continuing that tradition, we'll figure out a way to make it work." Mary was moved by the offer, but she was also realistic about the practicalities. She had a life in California, and her children had careers and families. The 40 acres would probably be more of a symbolic connection to her roots than a working farm. But she did express interest in preserving the original farmstead building and the family cemetery. "If this is where our family's story began," she said, "then it should be maintained as a place where future generations can come to understand their history." Chapter 12. The Legacy Revealed. Over the following year, Mary worked with local contractors to restore the original farmhouse on her 40 acres and preserve the historic outbuilding. The project created a connection between her California life and her Nebraska roots, bringing her to visit several times and strengthening her relationships with family members who'd welcomed her with growing warmth. Mary's restoration project also revealed additional family history that had been hidden or forgotten. In the basement of the original farmhouse, she found letters and documents that told the story of our great-great-grandparents' immigration from Germany and their struggle to establish a homestead on the Nebraska prairie. "Your grandfather wasn't the only one in the family who kept important secrets," Mary observed through boxes of century-old correspondence. "It seems like every generation had stories they thought were too complicated or painful to pass down." The revelation about Mary had opened up conversations throughout the family about the importance of sharing complete family history, even when those histories included difficult or uncomfortable truths. My cousins had begun asking older relatives about other family mysteries and several previously unknown stories. Uncle Bill discovered that our great-grandfather had briefly owned a second farm that was lost during the Depression, a failure that had shaped his determination to hold on to the family land at any cost. Aunt Catherine learned that our great-grandmother had been a published poet whose work had been largely forgotten at her death. These discoveries reinforced the lesson that Grandpa had tried to teach me through his secret legacy. The most valuable family inheritances aren't always monetary or material. They're the stories, connections, and understanding that help us know who we are and where we came. Chapter 13. Understanding what really matters. 2 years after finding the key under the plow, I stood in the restored farmhouse on Mary's 40 acres, surrounded by family members from 3 generations and 2 coasts. We were celebrating the completion of the restoration project and the establishment of the Family Heritage Foundation that would maintain the property for future generations. Looking around the room at cousins, aunts, uncles, and Mary's children and grandchildren, I realized that Grandpa's secret had ultimately brought the family closer together rather than driving us apart. The process of integrating Mary into our family story had forced all of us to think more deeply about what family really means and what we owe to each other across generations. Mary had used part of the trust fund to establish college scholarships for students from farming families who wanted to study agriculture or rural development. Her children had become actively involved in supporting sustainable farming initiatives in both California and Nebraska. The land that Grandpa had set aside for her had become a bridge connecting family members who might otherwise have lived completely separate lives. For me personally, the experience had been transformative in ways I was still discovering. I'd learned that inheritance isn't just about money or property. It's about responsibility, wisdom, and the courage to do what's right even when it's complicated. Grandpa had trusted me with his most important secret because he believed I would handle it with care and integrity. That trust had led me to make changes in my own life, that reflected the values Grandpa had tried to instill in me. I'd left my corporate job in Denver and moved back to Nebraska to help Marcus manage the family farm, using sustainable practices that honored the land's long-term health. I'd also become involved in agricultural education programs that helped young farmers learn both traditional techniques and modern conservation methods. Standing in that farmhouse, surrounded by the continuing story of our family, I finally understood what Grandpa had meant when he'd talked about valuable things that don't show up on paper. The most important inheritances are the ones that connect us to each other, that teach us who we are, and that inspire us to create something meaningful for the people who will come after us. The key I'd found under that old plow hadn't just opened a safe deposit box. It had opened a door to understanding what it really means to inherit a legacy worth preserving. Thank you for listening to my story about discovering that the most valuable inheritances are often the ones that come with the greatest responsibility. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you listening to this story? And if this resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel for more real-life stories about family, legacy, and the unexpected ways we discover what truly matters.